Hi, welcome to class. We're talking about fats today. This is everyone's favorite topic, I'm sure. So this is your chapter 5 that we're going to go into. Our learning objectives describe the structure of the lipids. We'll be able to tell us what these lipids are by the end of this class. We'll identify the types of fats and their dietary sources, and we're also going to look at the role that fats play in our diet. So there's 3 main types of lipids. We have triglycerides. This is the main source of lipids. They account for about 95% of all of our lipids, and they're usually found in both the diet and the body. Whereas the phospholipids are really only found in the diet. We do make some phospholipids, the lecithin, which can be made by the liver. And then we have sterols, which is the main source of dietary lipids, and we'll see those with cholesterol. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So why do we need fats? A lot of times fats get a bad reputation. You think fat and you think something ugly. But we do need fats in our diet. We need them to give us energy. They're the main source of energy stores. They're also the main source of fuel for our muscle work. They're important in the emergency reserves if we have a case of illness or extended period of time where we can't eat. This is when we would use fats. They're also important for padding of our vital organs. They cushion those organs around there. It's also important for insulation if we're in extreme temperatures, extreme hot, extreme cold. That fat's going to protect those organs as well. They're an important part of our cell membranes and also raw materials. They make things like bile and hormones. So those all are important reasons we need fats. It's also an important nutrient. Omega-3 fatty acids. These are essential fatty acids. We can't get them unless we eat them from the foods we have. They're a very dense source of energy. They are important for the transport of materials and raw materials. They also have a sensory appeal. How many people just love the fried foods? You may know it's not good for you, but it has that appeal to it. The crunchy exterior. It also helps with appetite, giving you the feeling of fullness, and it has a nice texture feel. Has anyone tried to make cookies with applesauce instead of fat? Anyone? The texture is very different if you take all the fat out, whereas the cookies that may be made with butter or oil have a little bit of a crispier texture and better mouthfeel. So fats play important roles in all of those things. So here's a picture of a fat cell. As you can see, they are outside of the muscle tissue. They're really packed in there kind of tightly, and there's blood capillaries around them. They can pack together without water. So this is how you can get a lot of fat in the external areas of your body without having all that extra water. And they can store more energy in a smaller space than carbohydrates. Remember last class we talked about how carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram, whereas fat is 9 calories per gram. You can get a lot more calories or more energy in less food or less volume of food than something like a protein or a carbohydrate. And as I mentioned, we need these fat stores for this insulation and the organ cushioning. So all those are important reasons for having fat stores in our body. So let's talk about triglycerides. Sometimes they're referred to as triacylglycerols. They're made up of 3 fatty acids, that's where the tri comes in, and then also a glycerol. And so here's some pictures of them. And if you notice, they have sometimes varying lengths. And this is based on the type of fatty acid, because there are multiple types of fatty acids that are available both in the diet and in our body. But the structure is the same. It's made up of 3 fatty acids and then that 1 glycerol bond. The types of fatty acids, we have saturated and unsaturated. It matters where our point of saturation is and how many points of unsaturation. For example, if it's just 1 point of unsaturated, it's monounsaturated. That's where the mono comes from 1. Polyunsaturated has multiple points, 2 or more areas of unsaturation. Let's talk about the saturated fats. In this little picture you see some butter or lard that's melting. Saturated fats are usually solid at room temperature. They're a fatty acid chain that holds all of the hydrogen atoms it possibly can hold. That's where it gets its name saturated. It's saturated with those hydrogen atoms. Some sources that you most commonly find saturated fat are things like animal products, butter, anything really that comes from an animal, like the exterior fat that you may see around pork or beef. the skin on chicken and turkey. Those are all sources of saturated fat. Like I said, they're mostly animal products for the saturated fat, but there are some vegetable and plant products, like coconut oil and palm oil. They also contain saturated fat. Our unsaturated fat has at least one point on the chain empty. There's no hydrogen bond at that. If there's just one, like I said, that's the monounsaturated. If there's more than one point without a hydrogen atom, that's a polyunsaturated. These are usually liquid at room temperature. So if you think of liquid fats like vegetable oils, olive oils, peanut oils, these are usually unsaturated fats. Other unsaturated fats are things like flax seeds, avocados, nuts, seeds. These are other good sources of unsaturated fat. The last fat that you may be hearing more and more about, this is a fairly recent fat as far as fats go. It's a trans fat. This is the process of taking unsaturated fats and making them saturated. So it's usually taking something that may be liquid, like a vegetable oil, and making it more solid. It makes it almost like a saturated fat, except it's different. It forces a hydrogen into that unsaturated link. So normally there wouldn't be a hydrogen there, but it's forcing there chemically. It loses all those health benefits that we would have gotten from unsaturated fats. And in fact has the complete opposite effect of unsaturated fats. Now it's going to raise your cholesterol, it can cause tissue inflammation. It's one of the worst fats that you can consume as far as heart health goes. And a lot of times you see these saturated fats in your processed foods. I usually use the example of something like Oreo cookies, that cream filling. It may not have any animal products in it that would normally be a solid, like a saturated fat, but it's taking something like a vegetable oil and making it into a thick and creamy filling. We also have essential fatty acids. These are important because we have to get them from the diet. They take part in the function of muscle relaxation, they take part in muscle contraction, blood vessel constriction and dilation, blood clotting, lipid regulation, immune response to fever and inflammation. We have omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, which are what they're most commonly referred to. And when you have deficiencies, this is when you see things like skin abnormalities, or kidney or liver disorders, sometimes reproductive failure. So these are really essential to our diet. Let's talk a little bit about the omega-3 fatty acids. These make EPA and DHA, which improve heart health. The main sources, a lot of times people think of omega-3 and they think of fish, fatty fish like salmon. Also other things like sardines and sea bass and oysters. These are all excellent sources of omega-3. You can also find it in flax seeds, walnuts, soybeans, canola oil, wheat germ. These are important sources for vegetarians to have if maybe they don't eat fish or if you have an allergy to fish. EPA and DHA, they collect in the cell membranes. They change the cell structures positively. And you also have DHA, which is found naturally in human breast milk. And you'll probably notice a lot of baby formulas now are adding DHA. They're adding this essential omega-3 fatty acids so that babies that are not breastfed get the benefits of this omega-3. The reason that's important is that some studies are suggesting maybe that it improves brain development in infants. And there's also a question of maybe having a role in delaying brain aging in elderly. So it's really important to our neurological statuses. So let's talk about phospholipids a little bit. This is the next category. The name kind of says it all. It's a lipid that has a phosphorus in it. So it's two fatty acids with a phosphorus attached to the glycerol. This is soluble in water. It'll dissolve in water. It helps the fats travel between the watery cell layers and the fat cell layers. And it also can act as an emulsifier. One of the most popular lecithins that you probably hear about is the phospholipids. This is found in egg yolks. Has anyone made homemade mayonnaise before?
Yes.
Yes. What's in it? Ann, tell me what's in mayonnaise.
Eggs and oil.
Mm-hmm. Egg yolks and oil. A lot of times people think it has dairy in it or some sort of milk because it looks creamy, but it's not. It's just oil and eggs. Now, oil normally is sort of a clearish color, a really thin liquid. But once you add that egg yolk and you blend it up really well, it acts as an emulsifier so that it keeps those particles suspended in the oil to keep it that really thick and creamy mayonnaise. So that's the lecithin in the egg yolk that does that. It's also produced naturally in the body, so even though you can get it from the diet, you can also get it from the liver, produced by the liver. The most common sterol is cholesterol, and this also can be made in the body, in the liver. It's important to the structure of cell membranes, so we do need some cholesterol in the body. The thing is, we make all the cholesterol we need. We don't have to get any dietary sources of cholesterol. It forms plaques that narrow arteries if we have too much of it, so that's why sometimes you hear when people have high cholesterol, they also have other risk factors for heart disease as well. We have plant sterols, which are very similar in structure to cholesterol, but because it mimics that cholesterol structure, it kind of competes for those areas that other cholesterol may fight for. So it can inhibit the cholesterol absorption in the digestive tract. How are fats digested? Not much happens in the stomach. Sort of just breaks down particles a little bit by chewing, and then fluid sort of wraps around it, but not much digestion takes place in the stomach. Once it gets to the small intestine, well, before it gets there, the gallbladder releases the bile, which helps break down the fats in the small intestine. And then the cells extract those lipids, and they're absorbed by the intestinal villi. Those are like the little finger things in the intestines. The large lipid fragments are converted back to triglycerides, and then the remaining bile is either it's reabsorbed or is excreted, and some of the cholesterol is also excreted in the feces. Then the fat that we have that hasn't been excreted is stored. It's transported by the chylomicrons to the external fat layers, also the breasts, some internal fat pads of the abdomen. These are stored for later use. If we have too much glucose in our diet, this can also be converted to fat. It starts with a glucose model. It's broken down into fragments. If we use it in the form of energy, then that's it, it's done. But if it's not used, it's going to be stored, it's going to be reconverted back into a fatty acid chain rather than into glucose. So, how do we use the fat? Fats are used by releasing fatty acids into the blood and combine fat fragments with glucose fragments. More fat will be used if less energy intake, or if we use more energy, such as exercise. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying if you eat less, you'll use more fat, because it's being stored. So if you have to get rid of, if you're using all of your glucose or your protein molecules, the fat's going to be the next thing to be used. So if you eat less, you can use more of the fat. The other way to do that is if you exercise more, you need more energy. So your body will start using that fat as excess forms of energy. The lipoproteins, very similar name you can figure out is lipids and proteins. They're made up of the proteins and lipids that help transport the lipids through the blood. And here's a picture of a lipoprotein here. Their major ones are very low density lipoproteins, low density lipoproteins, or high density lipoproteins. And we're going to talk about this a little bit. So as far as cholesterol goes, we have the VLDL, the very low density lipoproteins. These carry triglycerides and lipids to the body cells. The LDL, if you're ever getting a blood test done, has anyone had a blood test where they've tested for cholesterol?
Yes.
Sharon, did they look at your HDL and the LDL?
Yes, and they also did the ratio.
And the ratio, excellent. So they usually look at the LDL and the HDL. Very rarely do they look at the VLDL. A quick way to remember the LDL, L is for lousy. This is the bad cholesterol. You don't want high levels of this cholesterol in your body. They transport cholesterol and lipids to the tissues. They're usually lighter, larger, richer in cholesterol, and they can contribute to inflammation and heart disease risks. The HDL, the H for happy, this is the good cholesterol. This carries the cholesterol away from the body, away from the cells, to be disposed. So this is the good one. They're smaller, they're packed with more protein, and they oppose the inflammation. They protect against heart disease. So they're both cholesterol, however, they have different roles in the body, and one is more beneficial than the other. How do these things affect our body when it comes to the diet and our health? High saturated trans fats, these lead to heart disease because they both increase cholesterol. When it comes to dietary cholesterol, the cholesterol that you see in food when you're checking the food labels, if it says something high in cholesterol, then that means that it has cholesterol in the food, but it's not going to affect your blood cholesterol very much. It mostly comes from the saturated and trans fats that will raise your cholesterol. Cancer and obesity, they may also play roles. The saturated fats may play a role in increasing your cancer risk, And of course, since fat is so energy rich, it can play a role in calorie overconsumption when gained. So guidelines, you want between 20 to 35 calories, mostly unsaturated as far as total fat goes, less than 7% from saturated, very little from trans fat, and less than 300 milligrams per day for cholesterol. As I said, with saturated and trans fat, they play more role in blood cholesterol levels than the dietary cholesterol. And then you also have genetics and physical activity that can play roles in your cholesterol levels. So let's do a little activity. If we were going to trim saturated fat, now that we know what we're doing, where our sources of saturated fat come from, here's a pork chop. What's one way we can trim some of the saturated fat?
Take away the fat around the edges.
Trim the visible fat around the edges, exactly. So if you do that just by trimming the visible fat, you can save 220 calories and 9 grams of saturated fat just by trimming that visible fat. What about this baked potato loaded with butter and sour cream? How can we decrease the saturated fat in this baked potato? Yes, Sharon?
We could either not add as much and or get the low fat variety.
Right, so you can find some low-fat varieties that don't have the saturated fat in it, or if you eliminate it altogether, you can save yourself 18 grams of saturated fat. That is a huge difference. The baked potato itself is completely devoid of any saturated fat. And lastly, we have some milk. This is a whole milk. How can we decrease the saturated fat in the milk? Yes, Ann?
Use skim milk.
Use skim milk, exactly. Skim milk is fat-free or very low in fat, depending on what brand you get. And that will save you 8 grams of saturated fat right there. And a little joke for the day to end it. So if anybody has any questions, please see me after class, okay?
Thank you, Larissa.
Thank you.